In June 2026, a rocket company priced its shares at $86 billion and opened trading worth nearly $2 trillion, the largest public debut ever. But by the time you could buy a share, the biggest gains were already gone.
That's not a one-off story about one rocket company. It's the shape of something much bigger. Since 1996, the number of publicly traded companies in the United States has fallen by roughly half, even though the population has grown nearly 50%, and the economy, measured by GDP, has tripled in size. The country got bigger, the economy got bigger, the stock market, the one place ordinary people can actually buy a piece of that growth, got smaller. So where did all those companies go? And more importantly, who got left holding a much smaller door?
The scale of the decline is easy to miss because it happened slowly, over 3 decades. In 1996, 7,322 companies were listed on U.S. stock exchanges, the peak. Today, according to data compiled by Professor Jay Ritter at the University of Florida, known in finance circles as Mr. IPO for decades of tracking this exact number, there are roughly 3,700 to 4,000. Between 1980 and 2000, an average of more than 300 companies went public in America every year. Since 2000, that number has fallen below 100 a year, most years. Going public used to be a normal milestone for a growing business. Now it is the exception, not the rule. So if companies aren't going public, where is all that growth happening? Answer: privately, and increasingly so. Research published by finance professors Craig Deutsch, Andrew Carolloy, and Renee Stolz, often cited as the definitive study of what they call the listing gap, found this isn't a fluke of mergers or acquisitions. It's a genuine structural drop in how many companies even want to list publicly anymore. Over the same period the public count was cut in half, the number of U.S. companies backed by private equity grew from about 1,900 to over 11,000. The value didn't disappear. It just moved somewhere most people can't follow it. Why would a company avoid the public markets it once needed to grow? Because staying private got a lot more attractive. PwC, the accounting and consulting firm, estimates that public companies now spend $1 million or more every year just on the recurring cost of being public: audits, compliance, legal filings, quarterly disclosures. Underwriting fees alone, the cut paid to the banks that shepherd a company through an IPO, run 4 to 7% of everything raised. Meanwhile, private capital exploded, from $14 billion available to private companies in 2002 to $80 billion by 2019. Even the Securities and Exchange Commission's own chairman, Paul Atkins, has publicly named the regulatory burden as one of the main reasons companies delay going public for as long as possible, sometimes for over a decade. Here's almost nobody explains. While a company is private, somebody still gets to invest in it. Venture capital funds, private equity funds, hedge funds. But by law, only people who qualify as accredited investors are allowed in. And qualifying means one of two things: a net worth over $1 million, not counting your house, or an income over $200,000 a year, according to the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission's own rules. In other words, the biggest, earliest, often most lucrative stage of a company's growth is legally reserved for people who are already wealthy. Everyone else waits at the door until the company finally, optionally, goes public, if it ever does. And once a company does go public, the gains still aren't shared evenly. According to Federal Reserve data on the distribution of American wealth, the richest 1% of Americans now hold about half of all publicly traded stock in this country, some $27.5 trillion. The bottom 90% of Americans, put together, hold only about 13%. When the S&P 500 gains 20% in a year, the top 1% captures roughly half of that dollar gain, a single number that says more about who this market serves than any headline. So the public market shrank. The private market, gated by a wealth test, grew to fill the gap. And the public market that's left is still overwhelmingly owned by people who were already rich. Which raises an uncomfortable question. In America, whose wealth gap does this actually widen?
Let's answer that question directly, because the numbers are specific, and they are not close. This is where the story of the shrinking stock market runs straight into a much older story, the racial wealth gap in America. and it is not a coincidence that the two connect. Every barrier we just described, the accredited investor test, the retirement account, the venture capital check, falls disproportionately on the same households.
According to the Federal Reserve's own survey of consumer finances, only about 34% of Black households own any stock at all, compared with 61% of white households. When Black families do invest, they hold far less, a median of $16,500 in stock, compared with $67,800 for white families, roughly 4 times less. And according to the National Community Reinvestment Coalition, citing that same Federal Reserve data, stocks make up just 8% of Black Americans' financial wealth versus 35% for white Americans. That's not a small gap in one number. Only 44% of Black Americans have a retirement savings account at all, with a typical balance around $20,000, compared with 65% of white Americans, averaging $50,000. And even among the wealthiest 5% of Black households, they're more likely to hold conservative assets like real estate, bonds, and life insurance than white households at the same wealth level. It's the same gap, repeated across every measure.
Hispanic and Latino households tell a similar story. Federal Reserve data shows median stock holdings of about $24,500 for Hispanic families. Better than Black families, still a fraction of white households. Only around 16 to 26% of Hispanic households hold any stocks, bonds, or mutual funds at all. And according to the AARP Public Policy Institute, just 38% of Latino workers even have access to an employer-sponsored retirement plan in the first place, compared with 62% of white workers. There is real progress, though. Between 2016 and 2022, the overall wealth gap between Latino and white households narrowed from about 8-to-1 down to roughly 5-to-1. Still enormous, but moving. You cannot invest in a 401k that was never offered to you. Asian American households complicate the picture in an important way. On average, Asian families reported the highest household wealth of any group measured by the Federal Reserve in 2022, but that average hides enormous variation. Research using the National Asset Scorecard for Communities of Color found Japanese, Asian Indian, and Chinese American households with median wealth well above the white median, while in that same broader data, some Southeast Asian American communities show median wealth at a fraction of that rate. Naturalized Asian immigrants own homes at twice the rate of non-naturalized immigrants, 73% compared with 39%. And within that broad category, just 1 in 4 Mongolian American households owns a home, compared with 2 in 3 Taiwanese American households. A single average can hide 2 very different economies living under one label. Now consider the gap that gets mentioned the least. According to the U.S. Senate's Joint Economic Committee, citing Federal Reserve and FDIC data, the average Native American household holds about 8 cents of wealth for every $1 held by the average white household. More than 16% of American Indian and Alaska Native households don't have a bank account at all, compared with 2.5% of white households. The committee's own report is blunt about why. Decades of government asset stripping, banking redlining, and what it calls simple neglect. This is arguably the widest wealth gap in the entire country, and it almost never makes it into a story about the stock market. It would be easy to conclude that these communities simply choose not to invest. The research says otherwise. The Federal Reserve Bank of Minneapolis has found that a major driver is labor market risk. Black and Hispanic workers are more likely to hold jobs with higher unemployment risk and no safety net, which makes safe, liquid savings a rational choice over stock market risk. And access itself is unequal before any choice even happens. Black, Asian, and Latino workers are respectively 15, 13, and 42% less likely than white workers to have access to a job-based retirement plan in the private sector at all. This isn't about willingness. There's a cultural dimension too. Many families describe a simple fear of investing that's rarely discussed openly at home, often traced back to a relative's bad experience with a financial advisor who didn't have their best interests at heart. It's about which doors were open in the first place. And remember that private, wealth-gated market we talked about earlier? The one now capturing the growth that used to happen in public. Black-founded startups received less than 0.5% of the $138 billion in venture capital funding dispersed in 2023, according to Crunchbase. About $662 million total for an entire year across the whole country. That funding to Black founders fell 71% that year alone. Latino founders received under 2% of all venture capital. So it isn't only that public markets shrank, it's that the private markets replacing them are, by the numbers, even less accessible to the same communities already locked out of stocks. White men make up 58% of all venture investors and control 93% of venture capital assets, meaning the people deciding who gets funded next look overwhelmingly like the people who already have the most. None of this is unfixable, and some of it is already changing. Economists modeling baby bonds, government-seeded savings accounts for children born into low-wealth households, already piloted in Connecticut, Washington, D.C., and California. And one widely cited economic model projects they could shrink the median wealth gap between young Black and white adults from a factor of 16 down to just 1.4. Expanding automatic retirement plan enrollment closes another part of the gap directly, since so much of the disparity starts with who even gets offered a 401k. And reform to the accredited investor rule itself, proposals that would let financial knowledge, not just net worth, qualify someone to invest, could open the door that's been legally locked since the rule was written.
Here's the through line. The stock market didn't just get smaller, it got smaller in a very specific way. The growth moved into rooms that most Americans are legally barred from entering, and those rooms have never been equally open to Black, Latino, Asian, or Native American families. Record highs on the news are real. They're just increasingly a story about who was already inside.
To recap, since 1996, America has lost roughly half its publicly traded companies. The private markets that replaced them are legally gated to people who are already wealthy. And that gate falls hardest on the families who already own less, save less, and get less investment in the first place. Black, Latino, Asian, and Native American households alike. If this is the first time you've heard the term accredited investor, that's exactly the point. The systems that shape who builds wealth in America are rarely hidden. They're just rarely explained. If you want more stories like this, the systems hiding in plain sight, subscribe so you don't miss the next one.